In the year 1250, if you wanted to visit the largest city in North America, you wouldn't go to New York. That didn't exist yet. You wouldn't go to Boston? Didn't exist. Mexico City? Not for another 200 years. No, you travel to what is now southern Illinois, just across the river from modern-day St. Louis to a place we now call Cahokia. At its peak, Cahokia had a population of 40,000 people. That's bigger than London at the same time, bigger than Paris. It was the metropolis of the Mississippi River Valley, a sprawling urban center with massive earthwork pyramids, a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, complex political systems, and trade networks that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. And then, it vanished. By the time European colonizers arrived in the region, Cahokia had been abandoned for centuries. The people were gone. The knowledge of who built it, lost. The great wooden buildings had rotted away, leaving only mysterious mounds of earth. Today, we're going to reconstruct what happened. We're going to walk through the rise of the greatest pre-colonial city north of Mexico, explore what daily life was like at its height, and investigate the theories about why it collapsed. This is a story that should be as famous as Rome or Athens, but you've probably never heard it. Let's fix that. The first European Americans to encounter the mounds at Cahokia didn't know what to make of them. When French colonizers arrived in the region in the late 1600s, the mounds were already ancient, covered in trees, used by local indigenous peoples as landmarks but not inhabited. The French named the site after the Cahokia people, a small Illinois tribe living in the area. But here's the thing, the Cahokia tribe didn't build these mounds. They had no memory of who did. The city had been abandoned 400 years before the French arrived. By the 1800s, American settlers were obsessed with these mounds. Thousands of them dotted the eastern United States, from Wisconsin to Louisiana, from Oklahoma to New York, and white Americans came up with a wild theory to explain them, the mound builder myth. According to this theory, these earthworks were built by a lost race of white people, maybe Vikings, maybe Welshmen, maybe a lost tribe of Israel who had been killed off by the savage Indians. This wasn't just bad archaeology, it was propaganda. The mound builder myth served a political purpose. If indigenous Americans hadn't built these cities, then they weren't really the original inhabitants of the land. And if they weren't the original inhabitants, then white Americans weren't really stealing their land. It took until 1894 for the Smithsonian Institution to officially debunk this nonsense. Archaeologist Cyrus Thomas conducted a massive survey and concluded definitively, indigenous Americans built these mounds. Full stop. But the damage was done. By the time Thomas published his report, most of the mounds had already been destroyed, plowed over for farmland, excavated by treasure hunters, bulldozed for development. Of the original 120 mounds at Cahokia, only 80 survive today, but what survives is still breathtaking. Quick note before we continue. If you're enjoying this deep dive into forgotten history, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. This channel is all about exploring the parts of history that don't make it into textbooks. And there's a lot more where this came from. Alright, let's talk about what Cahokia actually was. To understand Cahokia, we need to rewind. Around 600 CE, the Mississippi River Valley was populated by scattered farming villages. People grew corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters of indigenous agriculture. They hunted deer and fished the rivers. They lived in small communities, maybe a few hundred people each. This pattern held for centuries. And then, around 1050 CE, something dramatic happened. In the span of just a few decades, Cahokia exploded. Population surged. Massive building projects began. The entire social structure of the region transformed. Archaeologists call this the Big Bang of Cahokian development. The centerpiece of this transformation was Monk's Mound, named after French Trappist monks who briefly lived on top of it in the 1800s. Monk's Mound is the largest earthwork in North America. Let me give you the stats. It's 100 feet tall, covers 14 acres at its base, and contains 22 million cubic feet of earth. For context, that's larger at the base than the Great Pyramid of Giza, and it was built entirely by hand. No wheels, no draft animals, just human labor, baskets of dirt, and an extraordinary level of social organization. At the top of Monk's Mound stood a massive wooden building, likely the residence of Cahokia's paramount chief and the center of political power. Surrounding Monk's Mound was the Grand Plaza, a 50-acre open space where thousands could gather for ceremonies, games, and public events. And beyond that, a carefully planned city. Cahokia was organized into distinct neighborhoods, each with its own smaller plazas and mounds. There were elite residential areas near the center, craft production zones where artisans made pottery, tools, and ceremonial objects, agricultural zones on the outskirts, and all of it was connected by a sophisticated understanding of urban planning. On the western edge of the city stood a structure archaeologists call Woodhenge, a circle of massive cedar posts that functioned as a solar calendar. By tracking the sunrise against specific posts, Cahokian astronomers could predict the equinoxes and solstices with precision. This wasn't just for curiosity, it was essential for agriculture. Knowing exactly when to plant crops meant the difference between abundance and starvation. Cahokia's influence stretched far beyond its city limits. Archaeologists have found materials at Cahokia that came from all over the continent. Copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, shells from the Gulf Coast, obsidian from the Yellowstone region. This wasn't random trade. This was an organized economic network with Cahokia at the center. Smaller settlements throughout the Mississippi Valley were clearly influenced by Cahokia's culture. They built similar mounds, adopted similar pottery styles, participated in the same religious practices. So what held this all together? Religion. Specifically, what archaeologists call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, sometimes called the Southern Death Cult. Though that name is a bit dramatic, this was a shared set of religious beliefs centered around cosmology, ancestor worship, and the relationship between the living and the dead. Cahokian elites claimed divine authority. They were intermediaries between the human world and the spirit world, and they demonstrated that authority through massive public works, astronomical knowledge, and elaborate ceremonies. The art of Cahokia is stunning. Copper plates engraved with images of falcon warriors, shell gorgets carved with intricate geometric designs, effigy pots shaped like humans and animals. This wasn't primitive. This was sophisticated, symbolic, deeply meaningful art. By 1100 CE, Cahokia's population had reached its peak, somewhere between 10,000 and 40,000 people, depending on which archaeologist you ask. Let me put that in perspective. In 1100, London had a population of around 15,000. Paris, maybe 25,000. Cahokia was one of the largest cities in the world, and it was right here, in what is now Illinois. If you're learning something new right now, if this is changing the way you think about pre-colonial America, leave a comment and let me know. What surprised you most? And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. We've got a lot more ground to cover. All right, let's get granular. What was it actually like to live in Cahokia at its height? Most people lived in rectangular houses with wooden frames covered in woven mats or thatched roofs. These weren't temporary structures. They were well-built homes designed to last. Inside, you'd find a central hearth for cooking and heat, raised sleeping platforms, storage pits dug into the floor for food preservation, tools made from stone, bone, and wood, and pottery for cooking and storage. The economy of Cahokia was based on agriculture, but it was more complex than just farming. The floodplain of the Mississippi was incredibly fertile. Cahokians grew massive amounts of corn, stout, which was a relatively new crop at the time, having been domesticated in Mesoamerica and slowly spread north. But they also grew squash, beans, sunflowers, and other crops. They hunted deer, turkey, and waterfowl. They fished the rivers and streams. And here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone was a farmer. Archaeological evidence shows clear specialization. Some people made pottery full-time. Others were expert stone tool makers. Some worked copper. Others were builders, astronomers, priests. This is the mark of a complex society. When you have enough surplus food that not everyone needs to farm, you can have specialists, and specialists create culture. Cahokia had a clear social hierarchy. In 1967, archaeologists excavated a site called Mound 72, about half a mile south of Monk's Mound. What they found was shocking. Buried in the mound were over 270 people, but these weren't all equal burials. One individual, likely a high-status male, was buried on a platform made of 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon. Surrounding him were elaborate grave goods, copper, mica, hundreds of arrowheads, and nearby, mass graves, 53 young women, apparently sacrificed, 4 men with their heads and hands missing, a pit containing the bodies of 39 people who showed signs of malnutrition and likely had been sacrificed as well. Let's be clear, this is evidence of human sacrifice and extreme social stratification. Cahokia was not an egalitarian society. Power was concentrated, and that power was maintained through religion, spectacle, and violence. But daily life wasn't all grim. Cahokians played games, most notably Chunky, a sport where players rolled a stone disc and then threw spears to land as close to where it stopped as possible. Chunky was wildly popular throughout the Mississippian world. People bet on games, played for status. It was a major social activity, and there were festivals. Major astronomical events like the solstices and equinoxes were marked with massive public gatherings. Imagine thousands of people crowding into the Grand Plaza, watching ceremonies on top of Monk's Mound, feasting, dancing, participating in rituals that reinforced their shared identity as Cahokians. For about 150 years, Cahokia thrived. It was the beating heart of a civilization. And then everything started to fall apart. Around 1200 CE, Cahokia began to decline. The population started to drop. Building projects stopped. The organized urban layout began to dissolve. By 1350, Cahokia was essentially abandoned. So what happened? This is one of the great mysteries of American archaeology, and there's no single answer. But there are several strong theories, and the truth is probably a combination of all of them. Theory 1. Environmental degradation. Cahokia's population boom put enormous strain on the local environment. To build the city, Cahokians needed timber, massive amounts of it. For the post and wood henge alone, they needed to cut down dozens of enormous cedar trees. Multiply that by all the buildings, all the palisade walls, all the firewood needed to heat homes and cook food for 40,000 people. Studies of pollen in soil cores show that by 1200, the landscape around Cahokia had been heavily deforested. Without trees, soil erodes, floods become more severe, game animals disappear, and firewood becomes scarce. And there's evidence that Cahokia experienced major flooding events in the 1200s. The city was built on a floodplain, which was great for agriculture, but terrible if the flooding got out of control. Deforestation would have made those floods worse. Theory 2. Climate change, tree ring data, and other climate proxies show that the Mississippi Valley experienced significant climate shifts during Cahokia's decline. There's evidence of both droughts and periods of unusual cold. For an agricultural society, even a few bad harvests in a row can be catastrophic. If the crops fail, people can't eat. If people can't eat, they leave. And if they leave, the whole system collapses. Theory 3. Warfare and political instability. Around 1175, Cahokia built a massive wooden palisade wall around its central core. This wasn't decorative. This was defensive. The wall was about 2 miles long, made of massive wooden posts set in deep trenches, and included watchtowers and bastions. Why would you build that unless you were afraid of attack? There's also evidence of violence throughout the Mississippian world during this period. Some smaller sites show signs of having been burned and abandoned suddenly. Skeletal remains show evidence of trauma. Heads bashed in, bodies dumped in mass graves. It's possible that Cahokia's dominance created resentment among the smaller communities in its network. Maybe there were rebellions. Maybe rival chiefdoms rose to challenge Cahokia's power. Maybe the whole political structure became unstable and collapsed into violence. Theory 4. Disease. Whenever you pack tens of thousands of people into a relatively small area, disease becomes a problem. Cahokia had no sewer system that we know of. Human waste had to be managed somehow, and with that many people, contamination of water sources was almost inevitable. There's also evidence that tuberculosis and other diseases were present in Mississippian populations. A major epidemic could have devastated the city and convinced survivors that the place was cursed. The combination effect. Here's what I think happened, and most archaeologists agree with some version of this. Cahokia didn't fall because of one thing. It fell because of everything at once. Environmental degradation made the land less productive. Climate shifts made agriculture unreliable. Political tensions rose as resources became scarce. Disease spread through the crowded city. And at some point, the people of Cahokia made a rational decision. This isn't working anymore. We need to leave. They dispersed. Some went north, some went south. They joined other communities, brought their knowledge and culture with them, and life went on. But Cahokia, the great metropolis, was finished. Within a few generations, the memory of who built it began to fade. By the time Europeans arrived, it was already a mystery. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you something. How does learning this change your view of American history? Does it bother you that this isn't taught in most schools? Let me know in the comments, and if you think more people should know this story, share this video. Okay, seriously, that's how we fight historical erasure. Today, what's left of Cahokia is a UNESCO World Heritage Site located just outside Collinsville, Illinois. You can visit, you can walk up Monk's Mound, you can stand in the Grand Plaza and try to imagine what it looked like when 40,000 people called this place home. But here's the tragedy. Most Americans have never heard of it. We teach American history as if it starts with Columbus, as if the land was empty before Europeans arrived, as if indigenous peoples were wandering nomads with no cities, no agriculture, no complex societies. That's not just wrong, it's a lie. Cahokia was part of a larger phenomenon called Mississippian culture, a network of chiefdoms and cities that thrived across the eastern United States from about 800 CE to 1600 CE. On other major sites include Moundville in Alabama, Etowah in Georgia, and Spiro in Oklahoma. These weren't isolated communities. They were connected through trade, shared religious practices, and cultural exchange. This was a civilization, and the descendants of the Mississippians are still here. The Osage Nation, the Chickasaw Nation, the Choctaw Nation, the Quapaw Nation, and many others. They didn't vanish. They survived colonization, forced removal, genocide, and cultural suppression, and they're working to reclaim and preserve the history of places like Cahokia. Modern archaeology at Cahokia is a collaboration. Indigenous archaeologists and tribal representatives work alongside academic researchers to ensure that this history is told correctly, respectfully, and completely. There's still so much we don't know. New excavations continue to reveal surprises. New mounds, new neighborhoods, new insights into how Cahokian society functioned. So why does Cahokia matter? Because it forces us to confront our assumptions about the past. Because it proves that the narrative we've been taught, that indigenous peoples had no cities, no history worth remembering, is false. Because it reminds us that civilizations rise and fall, and the lessons of their collapse are worth learning. And because 40,000 people once built something extraordinary on this land. They studied the stars. They created art. They played games. They loved and fought and worked and dreamed, and then they left. But the mounds remain, silent witnesses to a story that refuses to stay buried. If this video changed the way you think about American history, do 3 things. Subscribe to this channel because we're covering the stories that textbooks leave out. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and check the description for resources to keep learning. Thanks for watching. And remember, history isn't what we thought it was. It's so much bigger.